Thank you very much. It's a delight to introduce Babek, as has just been said. The thing with science and religion, and libertarianism and religion, is that both libertarianism and science never wants to make any quarrel with religion, but because when religion makes certain factual claims, it's almost bound to clash with science if the science shows up these factual claims as false. For example, if religious people say that the world is 7,000 years old and current geology indicates that it's a lot more than 7,000 years old, then there's going to be some sort of clash. Now, similarly, contrary to scientific Marxism, that has the idea that science crowds out religion, no science would ever bar someone on religious grounds, no matter what those religious, no matter what that religion is. A person from any religion at all is welcome as a scientist. And similarly, in libertarianism, which of course sets out to be as tolerant as we can, sets out to have no proactive coercion whatsoever. But if we must have some proactive coercion, to have as little as possible, then obviously we're not going to have any bar against any religion of any kind. But when religion becomes political, as religion has done in its heyday, and some people would say, with some justification, that a live religion will be political, then insofar as the religion is political, it's almost bound to clash with libertarianism. But this isn't libertarianism's desire, no more than it is the desire of science to clash with religion. So with that preface, I hand over to Babek.
Hi, good morning everyone. Thank you, David, for the introduction, and I would like to especially thank Tim for giving me this fantastic opportunity, which is a rare one, as I said to him just last night, to be able to, in such a forum, to be able to kind of crystallise one's thoughts, beliefs and experiences, and to be able to present them like this. I do confess to having some nerves. This is easily the biggest group I've spoken to since secondary school in Iran, where I had to do a presentation on the scientific virtues of ceramic and solar power, which I had no particular expertise on. And I do offer a similar disclaimer of sorts today, that I sit here not as an expert in libertarianism or in religious kind of theology in any particular way. This is essentially a personal account of my evolving thoughts as both a libertarian and as a Muslim. And I've only recently particularly been exposed to a great deal of libertarian literature, which has allowed me to kind of articulate thoughts which I've always felt have been long within inside of me. And this is particularly as a response to an upbringing of mine in Iran. And most of you are here, especially for the religious aspect of things, so the focus of my talk today is essentially on Islam and the possible relationship and compatibility it can have with the ideas of liberty and democracy and freedom of speech. Particularly identity is a hot topic issue at the moment, along with religion and ethnicity, given recent events in the past few days. So I should probably start off with giving a bit of a personal background to highlight certain aspects of my anomalous position as a libertarian Muslim, as Tim was also suggesting, growing up in Devon. I am a half British, half Iranian Shia Muslim, so thus my Islam is one of the minority sect rather than the majority, so thus that gives me kind of, again, I stand on the fringes of the faith. And I've been brought up in Devon, so again on the fringes of kind of intellectual discourse within Britain itself in a sense. And also, what I have to say about Iran, I do have to say, is very much a personal account. And every Iranian I've ever met has their own view of what Iran is and what Iran should be. So there's at least about 70, 80 million different views of what Iran is and what Iran should be, so this is just one of many. And my libertarianism, I feel, rooted very much in my experience of growing up in Iran, and oddly, my identity as a Muslim is very much rooted in my upbringing in Britain, which I think will be evident to many, particularly after what I've got to say. The interest I have in the relationship between Islam and liberty is rooted largely in the research I did for my bachelor degree dissertation, which was on the compatibility of democracy and Islam. And it was here that I was introduced to the works of Abdul Karim Soroush, who I don't know if any of you are aware of, but he's an Iranian intellectual who like me, occupies a particularly distinct, rarefied position within Iranian intellectual tradition. And that is largely because he is a man who is a trained chemist, so of a scientific background, but had a significant religious education in his youth. And so he's been able to fuse both aspects of that upbringing, which is actually rare in Iran, in the sense that the country is dominated, politically at least, essentially by the clergy, who may have particular expertise in the ideas of religious theory and religious jurisprudence, but have very little scientific education, or by technocrats who have a great deal of scientific understanding, particularly as in Iran, the most popular subjects are sort of engineering and mathematics. And I say this as my father, who is a religious man, but not with any great religious education per se, but is a lecturer in mechanical engineering. And every year, the most popular subjects after the national examinations for university entrance happen to be engineering of the chemical or mechanical or electrical engineering or the mathematics, and there's very little kind of popularity for the social sciences. Soroush, in that respect, as he comes from this background, particularly having had a postgraduate education in the UK, he argues for a middle ground, particularly when it comes to the issue of secularization. And he talks about, and other philosophers mention as well, the notion of objective and subjective secularization. Objective being the separation of the church and the state and the removal of the rights with respect to law of the clergy, which is what we would have seen in Europe. And then the subjective one is the idea of the entrance of the profane, profanation ending undermining certain cultural and religious values within the society. Now, Iran has tried both ends of the extremes of the three possible approaches to dealing with the issue of secularization. Initially, it went for what has been termed as a laic modernism, in the sense that it willingly acquiesced in accepting both forms of objective and subjective secularization under, this is prior to the revolution in Iran, and could be is similar in some respects to Turkey under Ataturk and their efforts of modernization, or Algeria under the military junta. Such was the popular backlash, in a sense, to the difficulties of modernity in Iran as a result of this late modernism, that it's now taken up the other end of the extreme, which is the anti-modern approach of rejectionist revivalism, as in harking back to kind of a bygone age, where it's trying to not only stop the aspects of the profane entering its society through subjective secularization, but also objective. So it's very much clearly brought the church and the state back as one in that respect. And what I have noted is the fact that both these approaches tend to authoritarianism, in the sense that they go against either the human desire for kind of socio-economic development in terms of being anti-modern, or the kind of the spiritual aspect of things, where it's forcibly inducing people to give up their religious or cultural values. And what Soroush is arguing, and what it's possibly the middle ground what people are trying to approach in both Turkey now, with the reintroduction of Islam into public life, or in Iran, is kind of the middle ground, or reflexive revivalism. And this naturally would mean a leaner religion, and given that religion and the state are on equal standing on the same thing in Iran, it would have to be a leaner state. And this is the particular problem, is the fact that religion has taken on so many burdens within Iran. It's naturally taken the blame and undermining religious understanding in Iran because of serious social and economic problems in Iran and serious ills. So, which has undermined the issue of human rights, as can be clearly seen after the reaction to the recent elections in Iran. So a key project of establishing human rights is naturally the restriction of the power of the state, which would lead to kind of certain libertarian views naturally. And I don't know if many of you have seen the German film The Lives of Others, about life under the Stasi in East Germany. That, I know many of the friends of mine have seen it as kind of an interesting historical account in some respects of what life would be like under a police state. But to me, that was, if not what exactly empirically life is like in Iran at the moment, it's what life would necessarily feel like growing up, where it was the natural assumption that we were always being listened into, and that you couldn't necessarily trust who you were talking to, and so that there's kind of that aspect of things has seeped into my own understanding. And a particular story that I've heard is that the former driver for my father at the university was, so he's always had some kind of a Herculean reputation of, say, in a snowstorm, he would drive through the drift, the snow, the blizzard, and buses and lorries would follow him, even though he was just in this little Range Rover. But one time he was denounced to the secret police, and after 2 days of questioning, he came out a broken man. So that's kind of, and he said that they knew things about him that he thought were only between him and God. So that was the extent to which the state can take effect on people's lives, and that's one of the aspects of kind of modern life to a certain extent in Iran, which has given me my own personal appreciation of what to behold dear. But there's also naturally, this has undermined the religious character of Iran. So, as I mentioned the issue of Turkey, I noted a couple of years ago when there was debate about to the extent to which religion should be allowed back into public life in Turkey. There were many people in Turkey who said, well, we're worried, we don't want to become like those crazy people in Iran. Naturally, we'll end up with an Islamic republic, which was kind of ironic in the sense that a very secular state has still retained its religious character within Turkey, and now they want to kind of find that difficult middle ground of allowing religion back in. And yet in Iran, where religion is thus imposed as it's naturally part of the state, it's seriously undermined religious faith and religious belief within Iran. And so there is barely anyone I know who's not a serious alcoholic or has drug problems in Iran. So despite the fact that Iran has tried to both stop objective and subjective secularization, it's probably succeeded in stopping the kind of the separation of church and state, but hasn't stopped vices from seeping in. Those vices that were so typically Western. And in a sense, this is kind of what the kind of the Iranian approach is kind of an anti-human as well as an anti-modern approach in trying to control and kind of restrict basic human impulses. And an example that has always stuck with me was one I read in a book by Azad al-Muawani, who is an American-Iranian journalist who also helped write Shirin Ebadi's book, or translate Shirin Ebadi, the human rights and women's rights lawyer in Iran. She helped her with her book, and in Muawani's own book, Lipstick Jihad, she talks of an example of hers when she was out in the street in Tehran with two girls and two boys. And I think the girls were in respective relationships with the boys, but there is a strict segregation of the sexes in Iran, so that a male and a female cannot be seen in public with each other unless they're married or direct relations. And the Basij, the unofficial kind of religious militia of Iran, which tend to be teenage boys with access to motorbikes and various blunt weapons, stopped them on the street and said, asked the girls why they were talking with the men. And one of the girls said, I have no idea what you're talking about, we don't know these men. And the Basiji very angrily said, well, clearly you were, what were you talking about? She said, I don't know this man, he's just asking me for directions. And so the Basiji decided to start beating up the man and said, do you still say you don't know him? And even though this was her boyfriend, she stood rigid and said, I have no idea who this man is. Until they left. And this is seen as a typical thing where in Iran one has to kind of limit your own basic human reactions to a situation where a loved one or someone close to you is beaten up. You have to actually deny that you know them. And it's kind of regularly seen as a way of forming cheating the system. So thus, basic human kind of interactions of human emotions are deemed unpermissible. So, unsurprisingly, Iran is finding itself democratically and religiously deficient in many areas. And this also extends to the economic realm, which has naturally undermined democracy, as can be seen, because as Suresh argues, democracy would stem from the freedom from need and necessity, and certainly not many people in Iran are free from need or necessity given current economic issues, particularly given how the economy and the society are so strictly controlled and planned. And there has been an official rejection of Western capitalism, as can be seen in kind of the speeches of President Ahmadinejad, who often regularly claims that Western capitalism will go the way of the Soviet Union. And he has also on record has said that he thanks God daily for not knowing any economics. So again, there's a kind of a veneration of stupidity in the social sciences realm, but also a veneration of poverty throughout historical discourse in Iran, particularly with the Sufi aesthetic, which is along with a hermetic kind of monkish aspect of life, where poverty is seen as something, as a greater aspect of life than wealth. And this has been reinforced by other religious thinkers such as Al-Ghazali and Faiz Kashani, who've argued that affluence will only breed corruption. So thus, in a sense, the Iranian government does not necessarily favour economic development, as this will only breed corruption and vices. And that the virtue of patience, the patience of the poor, and that intended virtue is given greater priority than gratitude, and the gratitude that comes from affluence. And someone so famous as Rumi, if you paraphrase him, has said, "Poverty is a better guard for the righteous than affluence," which has been challenged by many famous poets and writers in Iran, such as Saadi, who said that financially insecure is the same as being spiritually insecure. And that there are many virtues from affluence, but again, in official discourse in Iran, they've not been given the suitable prioritisation that they require. And this can be seen in someone like Imam Khomeini, who was a personally pious man and had a very frugal lifestyle, expected this very frugal as a whole. However, his successors have not necessarily followed in that line. And not only has there been economic corruption, but this has naturally led to some aspects of spiritual corruption. And certainly the popular opinion in Iran is that all the children, the various relatives and cronies of all the religious leaders have benefited greatly from the growing social inequalities in Iran, even if the people haven't necessarily benefited from all the natural resources Iran has to offer. But the problem has been in Iran so far has been the difficulty in articulating a clear message of opposition. And even though there is a freer exchange of ideas, which will naturally lead to a kind of a freer society thanks to the internet, naturally the government has been trying to clamp down on this. But there's still yet the reform movement hasn't been able to kind of identify a clear kind of message for what it hopes to achieve. And certainly it remains very dangerous in Iran to question the basic foundations and underpinnings of the Islamic Republic, in the sense that the church and the state should not be separated. And so even the reform movement is essentially, like so many ways, the way that the people in Iran identify economic and social problems, it's associated more with individual incompetence and corruption, rather than a criticism and an understanding of the inherent flaws of the system within itself. And sadly, communism, still anecdotally, I believe, remains the most dominant discourse of opposition in Iran, which was traditionally true, certainly under the reign of the Shah, and has only been criticised due more for its atheistic nature rather than the clear economic flaws that it has. And so it's debatable to a certain extent whether in Iran there is an appreciation of the issues and the problems that arise from planning within the economy. And especially as free trade is still seen as bringing with it many vices, and continuing to the same theme that poverty and patience is greater. So Iran will one day be great again. You just have to be patient with us. This kind of this particular message that the government is so willing to produce. And also, I think in the West there's been a certain complicity in having kind of seeing somehow Muslims as different, as being somehow incompatible with issues of liberty, in the sense that Islam is not portrayed as necessarily a religious revelation or as a truth, as Suresh would call it, but more as a civilization and as identity. And this is something that I came back across going back over Suresh's writings in preparation for this speech, in the sense that he'd been talking about that there are many different truths, and Islam is just one truth, and truths can cooperate, and there can be a discourse between truths. But if one always talks about identities or civilizations, what you're only going to get is you're going to get that clash of civilizations or that clash of identities. And he draws upon Hayek as well in talking about kind of the spontaneous design and unintended consequences of a civilization and how it evolves, which is clearly contrary to what Iranian official policy is in terms of trying to mould the society within a particular image. Yet there are clearly oppositional forces at work within Iran, which is clear after the elections, and I think there is some scope for optimism, certainly in terms of the potential breeding ground, a fertile breeding ground within Iran, within I think the region as a whole, for ideas of liberty. Because I think people, certainly from my upbringing in Iran, is what made me feel very keenly about these issues, which can be necessarily taken for granted, but clearly it's not something that can be taken for granted in Iran. And there are free market principles of sorts at work within Islam itself, in the terms of the fact that you can shop around for the religious cleric to follow. There is no rigid hierarchy, as can be seen in other religions, in terms of you can have your own personal beliefs and then follow the cleric who is most common, who has the views that are most in sync with your own. So you don't have to follow a particular religious cleric's kind of interpretations. And something that also kind of brought to light that was of interest is that the Shia brand of Islam is very much a fatalistic kind of brand of faith, in terms of the fact that, again, well, I suppose like many faiths in a sense, it kind of harks back to the perfect bylaw era, and that we should struggle to attain that perfection again, but in all likelihood it will not be attained. And there have been some brands of libertarianism, I believe, where such a similar viewpoint has been kind of espoused in terms of, well, we have to struggle for perfection even if it's not necessarily going to be attained. So, in formal conclusion, I would say I'm relatively optimistic that, as I said, there is a fertile breeding ground within Iran particularly, and there is nothing antithetical. I feel no particular contradiction within my own beliefs of the ideas of liberty, or the freedom of expression, and the freedom of expression of religion within my own faith, and with libertarianism as a whole. And there are universal ideas at play here. And that patience doesn't have to be the virtue of necessarily the poor, it can be so we can remain patient and optimistic that not only in the UK but across the world there may well be a brighter future ahead. And so
Is there any questions or contributions? Oh, Tim.
During the Cold War, some of the best anti-communists had either formally lived under communism, or indeed had been communists in their youth. And it seems to me that the phrase you used, fertile ground, in this context, seems very apt. And I just want to clarify, what you're saying is that because there is such oppression in parts of the Muslim world, in particular, your example is Iran, that we can expect a new generation of Muslim Solzhenitsyns or Bukowskis or whatever. Is that, I just want to clarify, that's your message, you're optimistic in a sense for the broader universalist libertarian movement, as I think you would put it?
That is essentially what I'd see it as. I think the main issue is the absence of I think many people in Iran would feel internally, or have a gut feeling as a sense, of what I've had. And so there would be kind of an appreciation for libertarian values. The issue has been thus far is the ability to articulate them. But as can be seen by many people who have left Iran and have moved to the West, that once they're exposed to those ideas, there's a significant resonance. And those ideas can be transmitted back. I'm sure that many people, though it would just require a flood of Hayek books or rhyme books into Iran that would actually give an articulation to kind of what people emotionally, or there's an emotive response to those sorts of aspects of things. So that's essentially kind of where I'll be coming from.
Thank you.
One argument that I have often heard against the Islam as being compatible with free ideas is that it has as part of it a law book, the Sharia, which is in itself very unfree, basically. How do you stand in that direction? How powerful is the Sharia, and how could this book stop basically a liberation of Islam?
Well, in a sense, the issue that I know that's been shared with many other people is the fact that the Sharia again, going back to this fatalistic bygone era aspects of things, the Sharia was very much as a product of its time. When it was the perfect Islamic society, which was naturally a very small society set up originally in Medina and then subsequently for Arabia as a whole. And there are people who argue that certain aspects of the Sharia, such as the chopping off of the hand of a thief or the stoning of adulterers, those things should only be within a perfect society, and we do not live in a perfect society. So the idea is that there should be no need to steal. When we live in a socially equal or a free society, there's no need for theft. But as we do not live in that society, the prescriptions of Sharia in response to that, these should not be applied. But current understanding is within many countries that the state chooses to apply those measures. And so it's not necessarily from a religious standpoint that those measures should be in place. I'm not sure if I'm explaining this quite clearly enough, but these measures exist within prescription, but they're open for contestation, and they have been since the beginning. It's most in terms of Islamic jurisprudence, the idea is that Islamic laws should always be ever evolving. It was at its time when a lot of these prescriptions first came about, they were very liberal for their values, and they. But what's happened is that there's been a certain complacency within the religion, saying, well, we were liberal then, it's okay, we'll keep it as it is. And that they've not evolved with the times. So the Sharia isn't some kind of, some measures may be seen as restrictive, but it shouldn't be applied restrictively as itself. It should be constantly open to contestation and to be ever evolving. That's how I would understand it.
The gentleman with the glasses and the striped shirt, please.
You made reference to the fact that Islam has no clerical structure comparable to the sort of papal, pope, archbishop, bishop, sort of authoritarian hierarchical structure of Christianity. Isn't one of the unfortunate side effects of Western influence and modernisation that you've got the imposition of this rather unfortunate hierarchical and essentially non-Islamic structure on Islam? And isn't it conceivable that one of the things that needs to take place is that Islamic thinkers need to explain how un-Islamic this structure is, create an Islamic model which is much closer to one of sort of clerics, each with their own set of competing ideas that people can choose from, and then out of that you could conceivably have liberal or even libertarian clerical congregations arriving in Islamic societies.
Yeah, I certainly agree with respect to Iran in terms of the fact that not everything we get from the West is necessarily a good thing. And in terms of the Islamic Republic as it is a very much a new foundation. It may hark back to it will make claims and try to ascertain its to assert its legitimacy from saying this is what Islam should be and how it was, but actually it isn't. But there are Islamic thinkers who have questioned it from the beginning and questioned it from when it was. There were particularly important ayatollahs who questioned them on Khomeini's kind of structure of what he was proposing when the constitution was written up. But the problem was that the constitution was following very much quickly a revolution where there was social chaos, and that the clerics were the most organised group at the time to be able to kind of take advantage of the situation. And then even the revolution itself was on shaky ground, and it was only the Iraq War that probably in many respects allowed it to stand. And subsequently it's been able to kind of quiet down, to clamp down on those kind of more independent Islamic thinkers, though their viewpoints are still they're still out there. And I think there is now greater criticism, and which can be seen actually, which is one of the more positive responses to the current situation in Iran, in the sense that you actually see clerics out protesting in the streets along with the students, and there are significant clerics who are actually questioning I think, have begun to question where this society that they've set up is where it's taking them. So I agree wholeheartedly in that sense.
The gent with the black t-shirt and the glasses.
Christopher Beavis, thank you very much indeed for that informed and informative and upbeat assessment for the future. As a Christian myself, I find it hard to share your optimism for the short and middle term, especially knowing what I know about the difficulties of proselytization by Christians among Muslims in the Middle East. But at a more practical level, I'd like to ask how much libertarian material there is available in Farsi, for instance, that could be distributed within Iran at the moment, and whether there's any prospect, for example, for internet broadcasts into Iran.
I can't give you any specifics about how much available there is there, though I do have a cousin of mine is of quite a philosophical bent, and yet he's never come across any libertarian literature. So I think there is a sufficient gap there. But I do think how internet savvy most young Iranian people are, I think the internet would be the best way to kind of to promulgate the message. But I do think there is quite a large group there to tap in terms of, I think you'll get there's a receptive audience, but that's just my understanding. And again, as I said, there are so many different views of Iran that maybe people who argue, well, no, that wouldn't. But I tend to, maybe it's the optimism of youth, but I tend to be slightly optimistic for what can happen in Iran.
Well, we're going into 10 minutes of extra time, which I said we're running a bit 10 minutes late. The gent with the anorak, white anorak in the middle, just here. Yeah, sorry.
You said that you think Sharia law is a product of its time and should be open to contestation, and then it needs to evolve. I wonder if you'd apply the same standard to the Quran, whether that is a product of its time, and if it's possible to be a follower of any holy book. And yesterday we heard about critical rationalism being compatible with libertarianism, and surely if you are a follower of a holy book, you certainly can't be a critical rationalist. Can you be a libertarian?
Well, there are actually plenty of people who have said that the Quran again is many Islamic thinkers themselves who've not had a kind of, they found no inner contradiction within their faith, and the fact that the Quran is essentially, it is in a sense, even though it can be seen as divine, it's a divine revelation. It's not a clear-cut case of what it's actually saying. That again, it's open to interpretation of how you choose to interpret the words. And so, yes, it is open to contestation. It doesn't necessarily mean that divine revelation itself is open to contestation. There are certain truths. But it's only through dialogue and through kind of using our own rational minds as believers and followers of the faith and listening to what other rational believers have to say that I think within the Quran and the Hadith, the followings of the Prophet, which again, have a slight have considerable ambiguity within them, and so that I don't see any particular contradiction of saying kind of as a rational you can question what is within kind of Islamic tradition, particularly as again the problem is that it depends how kind of you can kind of say it as a blanket term. You can be fundamentalist about it, say this is divine revelation, I'm not touching it, but you have to accept the fact that the Quran was passed down through oral traditions. So it wasn't actually written down in hand for several centuries after the Prophet. And also that the Hadith wasn't written down particularly per se. There was no kind of Islamic blueprint for an Islamic state, because there was no idea, there was no conception at the time of an Islamic state. No one ever had envisaged that everyone was to the extent it had. And so very quickly, Muslims found themselves in possession of an empire that they never expected. And so there's a clear distortion of some of the messages of Islam from a very early stage following the Prophet, peace be upon him, following his death, and his successors took the religion down various different avenues rather than what he would necessarily have followed. And there's so you can choose questioning something on the hijab, the wearing of the veil. That is actually a Persian tradition and not an Islamic one, which is a particular example that stood out to me looking back at it. It was the fact that it's an elitist idea that the Persian royal women would use hijab as a way of distinguishing from the common woman. And this was only introduced into Islam much after the death of the Prophet himself, where in fact hijab was only in place during his lifetime as a way that his house was open to the public, and he had just a veil, a simple veil like a curtain, rather than as a headscarf, as a curtain to separate his private home from there where he was, so that from his family, from the public domain of his house. And it's only subsequently that hijab has come to take on to, and the niqab and various other things has come to take on something far greater. And those are the things that should necessarily be open to contestation and to questioning of the root.
David Goldsmith.
Yeah, you said that the regime in Iran rejects Western capitalism and un-Islamic. Do you have any sense as to why it is that the regime is so welcoming of Western secular state socialism?
Now, there is a kind of an infiltration, I would say, to a certain extent, of the time of when a lot of the the clergy at the moment, when they were kind of undertaking their religious understanding, I think there's always been a kind of a groundswell of socialist kind of thought within Iran, particularly as a result of the Soviet Union's influence within Iran in the early part of the 20th century. So there's been that influence. But to be honest, a large part of Iranian policy always seems to be, doesn't necessarily come from a design. It's kind of an ad hoc reaction to something. And their planning seems to be just a way to support kind of the rentier economy that they have, their ability to kind of siphon off the profits of oil companies, or for the president's ability to travel around the country and to kind of dish out the profits from oil to gain support in areas where the regime has no great legitimacy, particularly kind of in the outer line provinces, where we see that there's actual violence taking place kind of on the frontier with Pakistan, or in fact the Khuzestan area in the southwest of Iran, kind of where there's a large ethnically Arab group, which and that's where all the oil is. And the Iranian regime has never been very secure there, and has not been very secure in the other aspects in the southeast of Iran, in the Sistan Balochistan area, where they're ethnically different. And again, in the northwest, on the border with Turkey, with the Azeris. And so, I think, and they've always claimed there's been outside infiltration. It's always US agents, and everything is always the fault of the United States. And I think their embrace of kind of that economic planning, in a sense, is a direct consequence of the fact that kind of engaging with the world is naturally going to lead to kind of infiltration of US values, or that somehow by trading with people, we're going to get like kind of, it's essentially kind of like, well, next thing we'll know will all be that Iran's going to turn into like an MTV music video. It's kind of the attitude that Iranian regimes will have to free trade.
The chap in the front row. Whether you can get it, thank you.
Thank you. You talk very much from the position of a secular person. I wonder what proportion of Islam that represents, because Islam comes from the word al-salim, submission or surrender, and submission or surrender to the word of Allah as manifested in the Quran or the Sunnah, the Hadith. And any attempt at individualism to rise above or be different puts one in conflict with this concept, puts one above the words, the ultimate inerrant scriptural words in these documents. And there is a very big conflict because the bulk of the Islam world happen to adhere to these precepts. I know you perhaps don't, and you talk very much as if everyone else might be in that category. I don't think that's true. And unfortunately, the Quran, in its laws about everything that we would find illiberal or unacceptable as libertarians, towards women, towards kuffar, the non-believers, what to do to defend Islam against oppressors or aggressors, and everyone can be defined as an aggressor. In fact, the attempt is always to make people into aggressors and Islam's as victims. This to me shows an incompatibility. And I wondered if perhaps you could address that issue, because as we are always concerned about the enormous immigration of people who might impose such values ultimately on us.
Yeah, kind of the idea of the reification of the individual and kind of how that takes within the ideas of submission is something that kind of has given me a great deal of kind of cause of concern in some respects. But then the idea of submission is one that submission has to come willingly as a rational individual. That you can't, submission is not something to be imposed, and that God has, this is again in the writings of I guess I speak from the perspective of the people that I've read and that thus follow, some like Sarush and that is their interpretation, that God has never willingly asked for, he doesn't want people to submit in terms of, well, this is the cultural value, or this is the way it is, it's a civilizational value. It is as a rational, we need to use our rational mind to be able to question the religion and then willingly submit to him. And that's how I would resolve that particular conflict. But again, I can understand it's very problematic. Now, the issue with kind of the certain aspects that seem incompatible, again, these are products essentially of the growth of Islam and its political growth. These are political issues rather than religious ones. And thus, as political ones, they can be challenged and they can be overcome. And that's my understanding of it, particularly when it comes to women's rights or to the notion of the outsider, because the outside, this again, certain aspects of that, they come from the relationship Islam had as very much a minority religion in Medina, and kind of it's the threat of complete extermination from the kind of the merchant class of Mecca, who through their polytheistic religions, they saw the hegemony over Arabia threatened by this emergence of this new religion. And so, but what has happened is that there's some kind of the slightly more warlike aspects, or the kind of more restrictive notions of Islam that might have been in place at the time, which were seen as war measures in a small society threatened by extermination. They then ended up seeping into kind of the greater understanding of Islam, when that was never the design, and that's not within the kind of the aspects of the divine revelation as it stands. It's more out of political necessity. Certain short-term measures might have been taken, or certain compromises might have been made, and unfortunately they still remain with us. And people have accepted them as necessarily as part of the religion, when in truth, I personally don't believe that. And I think there are plenty of people who would agree with me, but then there are plenty of people who don't. And I'm thinking about the issue. I'm very much coming from the perspective, I naturally show my background and how I come to understand these things. And I do have some concern for British Muslims brought up over here and how they would understand libertarianism. Now, I have certain optimism towards Iranians who've had no exposure to libertarian beliefs, but understand what a restrictive state is like and understand what economic problems are like. But as British Muslims, I'm not sure how receptive they would be, because I've often found myself in conflict with people from a different background, but as British Muslims within Britain itself. So how much that kind of aspect of things will work over here, I have no idea.
John Lester?
I very much like the idea of libertarian Muslims, or to be slightly more realistic, Muslims moving in a libertarian direction, as one of the ways of preventing a considerable amount of bloody conflicts that otherwise we see almost inevitable. On the other side, of course, it would be very nice if certain Western powers invade Islamic countries and kill hundreds of thousands of people, so I'm not putting all the blame on one side here. But while I know any number of people who would call themselves libertarian Christians and libertarian Jews, how many people other than yourself would call themselves libertarian Muslims?
Well, as Tim joked that I lead the vanguard from the southwest, I am the only one I know of. So, apparently I just seem to be providing the scones and the cream teas and that sort of thing. So I do, but as I said, I do stand very much in the minority position. And all I can advocate is a sense that I think there is scope for the increase, but that do they actually exist at the moment? That they're more a phantom presence in the sense that, and so yeah, that my optimism is very much rooted in a possible future rather than a definitive one or one that actually exists. I just think that there are certain universal values and beliefs that are compatible within the two, so there is scope for that. But again, this is, I think, as I was mentioning, it's kind of rooted in a region that has had serious socio-economic development problems. How much that can apply to libertarian Muslims brought over here, I'm not sure. But then other people, as I said, I'm not. My social circle seems to be largely non-libertarians and largely atheists. So maybe I should get out a little bit more in time to meet other fellow libertarian Muslims. But so I can't answer specifically in saying that yes, there's a large group of us ready to take down the regime in Iran just yet.
Lady in red? Yeah.
As a Muslim who can claim to be libertarian, would you support people who wanted to leave the Muslim religion? Would you?
In terms of the apostasy, then that kind of aspect of people giving up, I have no problem whatsoever with people. Religious faith is ever evolving, like political beliefs and what have you, and just as human beings as a whole. So personally, I know I speak from a very liberal background and saying I have no problem with people leaving the faith. I do realise that there is a problem in Britain as well of people saying, well, those who renounce the Islamic faith should be killed. That actually has no doctrinal value within Islam, but it's taken on life of its own in a sense that people say, well, that's how it should be. And that again is how myths are promulgated in the sense that there is nothing within the religion that says, well, if you're an apostate, you should be killed. But yeah, it's now popular belief, which should be challenged, and sadly isn't challenged as much as it should be. But speaking from a personal belief, I have no problem with that whatsoever.
Now we still have quite a few speakers actually, about 5 actually, but we've already gone to, we're already at just over 11:45. Is the feeling of the meeting that we ought to continue, or are we going to disappoint these? I don't want to disappoint these 5 speakers. I'm
quite happy in the break to speak to people.
Let's continue. I'm going to continue.
Can we have a rough show of hands if we'd like to continue another 5 or 10 minutes? All those against? Oh, I think the 4s have it. In that case then, I think the gent here, who's the gent just here with glasses, who's been waiting patiently.
Mine was just a quick one actually on the notes on the availability of libertarian texts in Farsi. I believe there is the Atlas Global Initiative, which I believe is an offshoot from the Cato Institute in the US. It's producing material both in Arabic and in Farsi. I believe the website, it kind of translates to something like Lamp of Liberty, especially in Arabic. I'm not sure what the Farsi version is, but I'm pretty sure it exists, and I think it provides news and some classic texts in libertarianism. So I think that would be a good place to sort of send anyone who wants to know about us in Farsi.
So you'll also, I just realised that, going back to the question of libertarian Muslims, I've just realised, as Nick mentioned, the Lamp of Liberty, there is actually the Minaret of Freedom, I believe, organisation.
Yes, that's right.
So that's certainly, there's one group kind of on the US side of the Atlantic that's kind of pushing forward kind of the compatibility ideas at any rate.
The lady here, in the second to third.
Lily Tennant. We've had a lot of questions about the incompatibility of libertarianism and Islam. I'm wondering, what do you think are the most appealing aspects of libertarianism to Muslims?
I'm trying to think what the most appealing to me has always been kind of the kind of the liberty side of things, rather than kind of necessarily the economic side of things. But that's just because I think it would be nice not to live in a society, or certainly I know that many people my relatives in Iran would feel not to live in a society where you think the state's breathing down the back of your neck, sort of thing. And I know that my family hasn't suffered nearly as much as other families in Iran have. Fortunately, I've not had any relatives kind of beaten up in the streets per se, but I do know members of my family who kind of suffer great depression out of the lack of freedom and liberty that they have to do the things that I have the ability to do. And I always feel a tremendous, both a sense of guilt in a sense, when I go back to Iran, of being able, kind of like, I get to enjoy certain freedoms and liberties that they just don't. And they do also assume I have a different girlfriend every week, which is naturally a concern of most Iranians. That happens actually beyond the subject of this morning's first thing of sex, because segregation of sexes is such that there is no basic interaction between boys and girls until they get to university, sort of thing. And even then it's very much limited. So it's in that respect, it's really quite simple social things that I think would appeal most to kind of Iranians in that respect. But
Can I just say that as a person to the LA, I'm actually going to overrule the democratic vote. Organisation is my property. Thank you both, but we have to...
I'm sorry for the speakers who couldn't speak.
My view is no democracy, it's a tyranny. I am in Whitehall. Thank you, Babek.